sure many of you, via over Team Day or just conversation or whatever, have heard me express my absolute disdain and hatred of the points-based estimation system and talk about how it worked in my past life. This laid out before you is how we did planning and estimation in my past life at Menlo Innovations using their, I believe, patented like planning game example. Now, this might actually be trademarked, so they were very kind to give me one of their packets that I believe they normally sell to people these days for educational purposes. And what you'll see here laid out is the entire project timeline for mywedding.com. This is their example project. They've been using it for over 10 years now since I've known them. And it's just something that I believe people can relate to for various reasons about planning out a website for planning a wedding. I was very amused after going to Contract for EXO and going back and talking to them about what they may have gotten or may have missed. But what you can see here is maybe various features and cards written out on index cards. These should be pretty analogous, if anybody's used Jira, Pivotal, Trello, whatever, to what you've had in the past. For example, Kathleen can view a budget spreadsheet. Is the title of the card? Allow Kathleen to access a page of budget data. The page contains preset categories and budget ranges. An additional column allows a recording of total amounts spent for each category to date. See team design for mockups and categories. Pretty simple, pretty standard story card. Has a title, has a body, has a pointer towards more information. The only real difference than what you're probably used to is that it is written on an actual card. Well, not an actual card, a copy of an actual card. We weren't allowed to handle the real index cards most of the time as developers. That was high-level project manager skills to be able to keep track of real index cards. The other thing you might notice is up in the corner here. Now, here is, this is going to be the most nauseous shaky cam work for this presentation, is a 32. That 32 doesn't represent jelly beans or t-shirt sizes or points or what have you. That represents a good faith estimate for hours of work. You might also notice, if you're here, that some of these other ones say 4, 8, or 16. You also might notice that these are folded to various sizes. That is because also in this room that can be seen by people are your budget. These sheets of paper each represent, I believe, in our world was $10,000 for a single week's worth of 2 developers. So 1 pair of developers for a single week, each of these $10,000. As you can see, this all laid out is a $60,000 project with 3 distinct release goals as color coordinated. A beta or a initial, a closed beta, and an open beta release. What you also might see is I've taken the liberty to lay out just a couple of stories for a initial plan. What you can see, and the other thing you might notice is there is this empty box here. I don't know if you've noticed any of these things on the recording, but the people in the room can see this. And after I've laid out that story, after I've laid out my plan, those boxes are filled. Those then are the features you're going to get for your money after 6 weeks is over, or you've spent $60,000. One or the other. And you might notice, hey, there's a lot of features left on the table. That is a good thing, because if, for example, somebody wants and is very, very passionate about having, a map for invitations. Well, that creates a pretty clear conversation point of, well, you can't just do that. That doesn't make any sense. This doesn't fit in here. So, okay, is a map for invitations more important than the ability to add a guest to your wedding registry or to view a guest list summary report? Well, maybe not more important than adding a guest, but maybe more important than the summary report, but you still don't have enough time yet. So maybe we don't need to print mailing labels, and we can move this over here. And voila, you've changed your plan. You haven't bloated your budget because this isn't scope creep, this is actual planning. And that's pretty much all there is to this system. This was a weekly event that occurred. You can also do things like, hey, I need more features in the open beta or in the initial beta. Okay, great. There we go. You got more budget in your initial beta now. You're going to have less budget in your final beta, or find more money to get more budget. It takes away all the ambiguity of points and how many points and so on and so forth, and just kind of lets them have full control over what they're actually getting from a week-to-week basis. The other thing I think I want to point out is that only 32 hours fits on one of these planning sheets. That's because we have an hour blocked out for project communication that's just going to happen, answering emails, an hour blocked out for stand-up, 2 hours for iteration kickoff, 2 hours for estimation, and 2 hours for show and tell every week. Those are the engines that drive the ability to create more stories if you need them, to fix estimates based on information learned, and so on and so forth. So every week, this would be regenerated by the project managers. Sometimes cards would end up smaller after the previous week worked. Sometimes they would end up bigger because we realized we poorly architected something. But what it gave you was, oh, this 16-hour card, where did papers go? Whatever. The 16-hour card became a 32-hour card. We found this out immediately. Do we want to continue doing this? Do you want to pull something else in there that's more important? Or, yeah, if you do want to consider doing this, then what gets pushed out of the bottom? Once again, just completely visual ways of representing all these things that are incredibly tactile. This method was used to run I think when I left, it was at 400 iterations. Every iteration is 1 week. 400 is about 8 years of business work with some gaps in there. It has been able to be used for just 1 or 2 weeks at a time to plan out the next few weeks. I believe it was used on a project from the first week to the last week to lay out the entire project every week. Mileage varies based on what the client needs, what the client's level of interaction and trust with us is, and so on and so forth. Let's see. There's other stuff that came in this packet that I don't necessarily need to talk about in this lightning talk, but if you're curious about why every single card says Kathleen on it, I can talk about that a little bit, or who the rest of these people are.
Yeah, let's hear it.
All right, so this is a UX thing that I can't talk to about really well because it's not necessarily my field, but these are the available personas for persona mapping. You kind of hear lip service to it here and there, I feel like, in a lot of these things, but what it really means is that all design should be performed towards a fictional third-party entity. And fictional is important because you don't want that person then coming in and actually overriding any design decisions unless you're making software for a single person. These personas represent various archetypes. They are supposed to be, chosen by the people who have the stakeholders in the project for who are primary, secondary, and tertiary, and really just represented on a board where you have your primary in the middle. That's supposed to be a face. Secondaries out here, and tertiaries, you might have more tertiaries. This, in the case of the wedding website, the people who created this scenario decided that the mother of the bride was actually the primary stakeholder in the wedding rather than the bride herself. And then the bride goes into the secondary or tertiary personas. This allows you to design, and also the mother of the bride is not just the mother of the bride. She is Kathleen Tober, a 52-year-old homemaker from, Dexter, Michigan, of course, who is not very good with computers and the internet. So it lets you tailor your designs towards that person. Now, you could say it's nice to have things for the secondary and tertiary personas occasionally, but the kind of principle behind it is anything that will detract from the primary persona's usage of the site and for the benefit of the secondary and tertiary should not be included in your design, essentially. So, yeah, these are all and I think these are a little more filled out, I think, than even the IDEO ones, because I believe the IDEO ones were very kind of clinical. These also have things like, Kathleen wants to plan the wedding of the century, yes, but she also wants to buy a new kayak and, avoids situations where she's left talking to people who use terms she doesn't understand. So they're fully fleshed out people to some degree, and it works, once again, because you can't say, I want this anymore. It becomes a conversation about what Kathleen wants in the website. For the flow cytometer, we ran, the one that ran for about 400 iterations. Our primary persona was Brad, who was the grad student that isn't allowed to touch the really expensive machine, but can use our, $20,000 machine instead of a $300,000 machine. So that is what those are. I think there was more in that packet. There's the estimation packet, which is how these times are generated, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that's mostly planning game. Any questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
So I feel like, well, first of all, I really like visual representation, but then I also feel like it kind of assumes that all stories are mutually exclusive. So, for example, let's say that this is a 32, but you also want to do the 16. So you're saying, okay, let's move these 16s out, and let's do this 32. But let's say that the 32 is dependent on the 16. How do you?
So that is usually a act of story writing. You want to write your stories so that they're individually encapsulated pieces of work. And if you have dependencies and hard dependencies, then you have to be able to express those in a way that says, okay, if you want to play this feature without playing these two other features, then the estimate is this big. But if you play these two other features, then the estimate shrinks. It's the fact that if you, for example, this one depended on these two, and you played it this way, maybe this is no longer a 32-hour estimate. Maybe it's an 8-hour estimate after those two are played, and it's worth your investment in those two. If you ask them and say, hey, these two seem linked, and they say, oh, yeah, they are linked logically, but they're not linked in the code. This is going to be 64 total hours of work. It's just that way. It's once again, it's a tool to facilitate communication.
So is this more of a internal tool, or do you bring in at what point do you bring in your client?
The client is the one that has to make the decisions.
Yes.
We can lay out a preliminary plan, but they don't get taped to the paper until the client approves them.
So we're writing stories.
Yes. We're making the estimates.
And then we give them all the estimates and stories,
Yeah.
and we're like,
here's what we like. With longer running clients, the project manager will have a good sense of okay, I know what your priority is next. Here are the stories we think you want, and they'll be like, what's this one over here? I don't know. And then they say, oh, well, okay, that's why we do need this, why we don't need this. But ultimately, yeah, nothing gets taped down until the client actually agrees to it. Another way of letting them know exactly what they're getting out of a software project. This has worked for remote and distant clients. It's a lot harder. What it ends up being is the project manager creates 2 of these packets every week, and UPS is one of them out to them, and then they run the planning game over webcam in parallel, essentially, to say, okay, this is this is your final layout that you want. Make sure that I've got it right. Okay, let's save it down. But it's still them with their hands on real things every week making the decisions.
What do you think the best way to transfer a client over from because everybody loves these arbitrary point systems?
I don't know. So this is the part that is always the trickiest, because I feel like points are there to protect people from behaviors that are already bad. So if you're already engaging in toxic behaviors that you need this blanket of points, then you're going to have a lot of problems anyways. I think we talked about this a bit on team day, is like there are too many people that do not understand that estimates are a planning tool and not a prophecy tool. That is something that you just have to demonstrate the value of at some point, because I feel like the people that are very appreciative of this system and the system in general are the people who have been burned by people like hiding the fact that things will take longer than they initially said. Like, if you make an estimate and you're going to go over your estimate, you should know pretty early if something is twice as hard as you think it's going to be, or 4 times as hard as you think it's going to be. And if you are properly incentivized to not hide that, that is really valuable information rather than something you should be punished for. So if you can transition, if it's great that the points don't matter and everything's made up, then then great. It should be a simple thing. But I feel like whenever I bring up real hour estimates, a lot of developers, they cringe like, beaten dogs, because they have been beaten over and over again because of it in the past. It's one of those things that requires kind of both sides to meet and agree on something. The project managers need to know that they are getting better information and more reliable information from the developers, and the developers know that the project managers need to protect them from the stakeholders when they get angry about these things, because they are actually getting more value out of this in the long run. You get actual communication and actual information out of this as opposed to the point system.
Is the basis of this discussion that customers prefer points?
It's more so that they've been taught.
I think teams, a lot of the places prefer points, because there is that layer of disassociation that lets you kind of be like, well, they're points. They don't really mean anything. We didn't hit our points. Oh no.
That's part of it. In some cases, there's also a school of thought about estimating relative complexity instead of trying to predict time.
Yeah, but the problem is that relative complexity doesn't actually add any ability for planning right? It doesn't actually, because what it comes down to in the end is still time and money.
So I'm curious, so you're talking about how estimates are not promises of what will be delivered. But at the start, you're describing the system as something that helps them know exactly what they're going to get for their money. So if this is a weekly exercise, what's the degree of upfront planning and design to say, we see here sort of a finished project. I'm imagining you probably didn't start week 1 with cards written for all the weeks, and then sort of deciding how are you going to, we know exactly how to build this.
You can start with that, but as you work, right, you'll write more cards. You'll have to have discussions about the budget if you discover complexity. So if anybody who knows exactly what they're going to get in week 1 is not a client that you want to work with, because that is somebody who doesn't want you as a collaborator. They want you to build something in like a set box without all the information. There's no way they have all the
It's
information.
building to spec.
Right,
So
exactly.
how does this, so how does estimating hours and exact cards avoid the trap of sort of trying to code to a spec, saying, okay, if we have to say it's going to be like X hours, that means we're going to sort of decide implementation details in the estimation phase.
Let's see. It doesn't necessarily save you from that. There's other parts that are designed to more save you from that. Once again, giving them the fact that this is an estimate, laying out preliminary cards, maybe not necessarily detailed story cards, because that's the other part of this is each of these things, any story card that is written has to be able to, most of the time, be done within a week of work, be validatable by the information that's on the card by a third party, and I forget. There's a couple of rules for writing a story card. It's not the Mythic Man month. I forget the name of the principle, right? You start with, you want to put a man on the moon. Does that take more than a week? Yes.
That's Mythical Man month.
Is it the Mythical Man month? Okay, then you break that into train an astronaut, build a rocket. Those take more than a week. Then you break those down, You can start with very vague estimates for large feature sets that say, you might just write down on one of these planning sheets, payment integration. And then as you near it, then you put that further out and you say, okay, we have a vague idea. It takes 2 weeks to do payment integration. Maybe. And then as you go out, you then start writing real cards for it as you near it because you have design work that's being done around it, hopefully. Here's the other thing that this also needs is it needs design and development to run in parallel. Design needs to be a little ahead so that you can estimate their things, but they need to be there and available to be able to react to things that are going to cost you more time. For example, if you're like, that's a bad example probably, but I've seen a few of them like this, a drop down here will be 5 times as expensive than if you just want a text box. Why do we need a drop down? And they're like, well, if they come back with, well, we talked to actual users and this and this and this and this, then you're like, oh, great. Well, let's justify that to the client. If they say, oh, we thought it looked pretty, then you can go back to a text box, things shrink, these things reflect, client is happy.
What would you say are some of the pros and cons of having physical paper that you can move and put down and handwritten cards that you're taping down versus having something online?
I really think the pros are if you immediately engage with it a lot easier. If you show somebody Jira, Jira is the worst of the examples, but even if you show them Pivotal Tracker, it is immediately this swirling disco void of complex buttons and features that don't necessarily make sense because it was made by developers for developers most of the time. This, I hope that most people can understand this. It really is it's a block game in kindergarten, right? And you can, if it fits, it's in your budget. If it doesn't fit, it's out of your budget.
I also really like the inability to introduce scope creep. Because with Pivotal, one of the problems I often have with clients is that I'm just gonna add one design story. It's just a quick revision. But then that happens every morning, and all of a sudden I've done 5 times the amount of cards in an engagement than I originally had.
Right. And this doesn't stop them from writing any cards, but it doesn't make it on the plan unless it fits. And it doesn't get on the plan unless it's estimated and all those things. I think some people think that it's easier to lose these things. I don't believe we've ever lost, my old company, they've ever lost a physical card. They've lost stories in Jira before, but they've never actually lost a physical card. I think the Flow Cytometer project was in the card number. The card numbers go from, also the other thing I like is the card numbers go from 1 to wherever you are, as opposed to Pivotal, where I think
You need an estimate?
No, card number 1.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Wedding.com number 1, enter a wedding detail. But I think we were in the card numbers in the 10,000s by the end of it because You don't necessarily play all of them, but you write all of them, you number all of them, you track all of them. They have a system. This is the part where, project manager magic came in. I don't quite get it, how they track them, but they managed it, and it was, and on the downside, I guess it's not as environmentally friendly. We print out one of these like a week. They all get recycled in the end, but.
Does everything have to be in Level 2?
It makes it easier.
Right? Easier.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if it's a rule.
It's a bit of a rule if you can figure out how to fold things but also at the same time, it doesn't really give you a lot of extra help. And if something takes 3 hours versus taking 4 hours, you're not really getting a lot out of it. If it takes 5 hours but when it doubles, that's when it really becomes interesting to most clients, I would think. Unless they're really, really strict about their timeline, which in case is another client you probably don't want to work for if they're going to get angry for something taking 3 hours instead of 2.
I've had those clients. And, I want to just pause that people that are remote can ask questions. Did they have any? Now you have to have some.
Ask some questions. Do it, Jack.
We're all counting on you.
I was curious what you said the name was of the system, or where'd you got it from?
The company I worked for was Innovation, the little place in Ann Arbor, Michigan. The system is called Planning Game, or I think it was Planning Origami is the other one.
I feel like that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was part of a whole system. It kind of goes from an estimation to show and tell to planning game, and then it loops around, because the show and tell is so that they get a sense of where you are, so they know what needs to go into the next plan. Estimation comes before that to make sure that all the plan is up to date and its size and scope. Also, I'm not sure if these estimates are arbitrary, and I've not actually validated each of these cards.
An example of something like a 32-hour estimate, where it has 5 different features, and each of those features has a lot of implications.
Mm-hmm.
In that sort of case, in your experience, what were you using for checklists and making sure that, say, down to the unit level, because that's sort of a high-level feature, but not, there are a lot of requirements, granular details that you might have to flesh out on that.
That was usually QA was present in our estimates. So if they saw cards like that, they would also advocate for probably splitting them into smaller cards. If the 32-hour card can't be logically user useful, that was another constraint on the cards. Is they are all usually written, once again, from Kathleen's point of view, so that the only way a card is actually useful is that if Kathleen can see something at the end of it. So cards that say, technical jargon, clean up the bus or whatever, like in the background, so blah, 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 not usually useful. That could be the technical implementation of a card that says improve Kathleen's load time on her Dell 2600 laptop by 4 seconds if they're big cards, I think we Kanban them a lot about various tasks in them, about what's doing and done. Once again, cards are not meant to be the entirety of the feature of project. They are a placeholder for a conversation.
And where is that tracked or recorded?
It's you can amend the card. If it really is becoming way too big to contain on a single card, you look for logical places to cut them off. Error validation and things like that sometimes are those where it gets cut off, where it's like, okay, here are a bunch of things that can't be tracked on this card, which is already 32 hours. Let's write a couple of 8-hour cards and shrink this one a little bit or something. Or maybe it doesn't shrink. Maybe you're just finding new features that need to go on for this to completely make sense. It's an ongoing thing, right? You end up writing a lot more cards. You end up actually splitting them. You end up, maybe discarding old cards. Well, never really discarding, but deprioritizing them because you're finding out that, hey, the client doesn't have the information for this either yet. Maybe that can't be done right now. Maybe we need to do something else right you find out certain times that, hey, the feature that the client thought was so awesome, it got really, really poor reactions from human beings when they were putting it in front of them. Those go away completely. So, yeah.
I had a question about if you, I can see how this is a really good client-facing tool, but then when you take it back to like the team or any engineer who would work on it, would you then, I would imagine that you might be tempted to translate these into something on a tracker, a pivot tracker type thing. Or do you literally like stick to the letter of the law?
This was, okay, this is something that I didn't think I'd have, well, I don't have the time or the actual stuff to do, but literally what we would have is a corkboard that would have, and I think our iteration started on Wednesday. Okay, and up at the top, we would have team names, which would have the people working on it. And I don't know you guys' Agile shortcuts as easily, which is first initial. I can't translate that as easily for some reason. All right, so anyways, you would literally have these, and say you had a 16-hour card, that would literally be right here on the board. And the other thing that would be on the board is a string that moved down the board as the days progressed. And you could see from across the room how the team was doing at any given moment, because you would expect things above the string to be green and finished, and things below the string to be in progress or not finished, or not even started. So that was how it actually worked out in the real world, is you would look at your board, you could see it from any place in the office, because it was huge, it was bigger than this, and you could, not even as a developer, just any person that walked into the space could get a good sense of how the team was doing on any given iteration.
And of course, these would have to match, the board would have to match the size so that they fit.
Well, no, not necessarily.
Right,
It's just like, right, it's 16 hours, so it would be, you would expect it to be on Thursday, right? If the iteration started on Wednesday, and by the time it was Friday, yeah,
it doesn't like cover the space that it would, I mean.
How do you deal with
Probably good keeping.
people with teams falling behind? Like, what sort of remediation efforts? Because this seems like it gets a little bit lockstep. So if I fall behind and we start knocking off.
Well, okay, so
the client's gonna probably do it.
It comes down to, here's part of it. It comes down to, why is that happening when that happens? Do we need to dedicate a little time to re-architecting or things like that? Then we have to try to communicate that to the client in terms of, okay, if you trust us, we think that by re-architecting, we'll save this much on future stories. The other part would be, I think the thing that my boss always quoted was that you're expected to have 2% accuracy with your estimates. 49% will be too high, 49% will be too low, and 2% will be exact. Most of the time, if you're lagging someplace, other members of your team might be ahead. If that's the case, they have, something down here that's already green, then they would expect to come into your lane and help you out with things that are forward on it.
Oh, so each of those rows are pairs.
Yeah.
All right.
So yeah, if the entire team starts falling behind, that's a bigger problem anyways, and that needs to be addressed with the client. It's like, well, everything we're doing seems to be more complicated than we initially anticipated. Do you want to hire a new company, maybe? I mean, it's like, if we can't do any of this in the time we think we're supposed to be doing, then that's a real problem.
Was that a company, is another one of the consultancies that runs a week-to-week contract?
Yeah, essentially, yeah, we
You
can
can
do.
choose any week, you can stop and we'll just see what we have. And the contract, there are no long-term contracts.
Exactly. Well, I mean, we have agreements and budgets, but yes, I believe that was part of the deal was that we would give them the source code every week so that they could take it away if they wanted to.
Airbnb software development.
So yeah, that was a much longer lightning talk than I anticipated, but.
No, it was a short lightning talk with a lot of questions, which is probably to be expected because it's a hot button topic. Are there any other questions from the remote engineering team? No more for Jack. Everybody can tell Jack's looking at. No more for Jack. All right. Thanks again, John.